Good, whatever time of day it is, people. Welcome back to another random chat that I'm having. This gentleman has been with me before, but I'll let him introduce himself, give us his name, and what his posh job title is these days, because I think it's more than it was last time. Jonny.
Very good to be here again, Reese. Good to be speaking to the audience, the wonderful audience that you've managed to cultivate to talk about interesting things. So, yes, since we last spoke, back then I was very focused on the entire wide world of platforms, application platforms, the burgeoning world of AI platforms. Nowadays, my time is spent with a dedication to the public sector, albeit I'm lucky enough to still go in very occasionally and speak to other organizations. My slightly daft title, really, I know that you would say Chief Handwaver, which I think is pretty valid, really. Chief Digital Advisor for UK Public Sector here at Red Hat. So what I'm doing nowadays is advising, enabling, supporting government to adopt open source technologies, solutions, however we want to frame it, but still very oriented. In fact, I'm wearing this sweatshirt on purpose, oriented on the people, then the process, then the tech, because I think that's still the order that matters.
Can I just say, Jonny doesn't just speak to PubSec. He does speak to anybody that's willing to listen. So feel free to reach out to him if you have any questions around what we do. And certainly platforms, he's not going to say it, but he has written a book. Go buy it, because then he can buy me more beer next time. Anyway, how's the year gone for you, John?
It's been a crazy year. I mean, so January was when I shifted focus slightly to being completely oriented around public sector, albeit, as you say, I will speak to anyone, because that's how you learn things, that's how you pick information up, and that's how you find out what the hell is actually going on in the world. And in that role of working with public sector, I think it has been more important this year than ever to actually have a very broad base of knowledge, a very broad base of learning, and a very broad network as well of people who are doing fantastic things. For me personally, I think this year has been a busy one. Lots of time in London, lots of time around Westminster, so travelling down from the Peak District where I am. Fortunately, it does mean I get to travel via Stafford and occasionally be in your neck of the woods as well. And sometimes that's meant as well that we've been hopping around the country on tour, speaking to lots of wonderful AWS communities, which has been an absolute highlight, not just for the beer at the meetups, but also for the great conversation. But yeah, I think it's been a very busy year with lots of shifting sands in a space where, especially with a government perspective on, new government still finding its feet, learning about technology strategy and the implementation that can improve things for the state. But most importantly, for people who are listening, who are probably not looking for that public sector view, what's been really interesting is how leaders have embraced AI, sometimes for good, sometimes not so much for good. And the gray areas there, a lot of binary decision making. And I think that's probably my conclusion. There's a few words that have popped up a lot this year. So sovereignty, agency, but especially choice. And I think choice has always been at the beating heart of open source conversations, but this year more than ever, trying to urge people to actually understand the choices they could or should be making. So that's probably a bit of a summary of how 2025 has looked for me, really.
Okay, so then before we get into what you've actually done, obviously you knew you were changing and you were becoming focused on PubSec. What did you think your conversations were mostly going to be about this year?
Right. It's a fantastic question. So obviously you and I have done lots of work around cloud managed services, which I absolutely love. We were able to do some brilliant work as well with our beloved colleague Pio before he moved on to pastures new. And I think, yeah, traitor. Another very apt 2025 theme, to be fair. Traitors being very popular. But yeah, I think we were doing so much stuff at the tail end of last year as well, thinking about cloud managed services. I really started this year thinking that actually that story that we are still telling that is so vitally important, that is still getting traction around the fact that most organizations have huge amounts of sprawl, huge amounts of duplication, and they are effectively managing things that they probably don't need to manage anymore. Like I used the phrase with a large government organization a few months ago, legacy Kubernetes, and they kind of scratched their head and said, what do you mean by that? And I went, well, legacy Kubernetes is where, okay, you're using something that looks and feels a bit like a managed service for your container orchestration, But all of the other stuff you're handling yourself. It's all super manual. The config is all stuff that you're having to manage. All the integration points, the bits that no one really thinks about. You see the building bricks, but no one talks about the mortar. So all those integration points especially are not opinionated. There's loads of config, and yes, it keeps your engineers busy, but you don't have a unified patching path. You don't have a unified upgrade path. You're in this place where you're taking on loads of cognitive load, and the pressure is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger to do more stuff in your team, whether it be virtualization, AI, edge, you name it, it's coming for you. So at the start of the year, I thought sprawl, which is still relevant, was going to be a leading theme, leading topic. And I thought as well, the kind of how do we liberate platform teams from cognitive load, from this burden, but also to improve developer experience, like focus on where the value matters. To a large extent, that has been an anchor point of the conversation, but my God, has it expanded and grown as well.
So the next question, obviously you knew where this was leading, is what did you actually end up focusing on? And I bet it's not the one particular topic, if not both topics, that we've both had to spend a lot of time talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know your thoughts as well of where you thought the year was going to start, what those themes would be, and then where you've seen them evolve as well. Because in relation to the work that we've been doing, for me, I think the AI conversations have just skyrocketed. And for most organizations, this is around the misunderstanding of AI. So I've been writing about it quite extensively, mainly on LinkedIn, but I've been lucky enough to get some coverage in the press, trying to advocate for the fact that actually the skills that we have, there's a skills gap, but actually a huge amount of that skills gap is leadership, not just engineering. In terms of engineering disciplines and prowess, we've invested heavily in data science. Most organizations have, at least, in data science, in prompt engineering skills, for example. And that's two ends of the spectrum, but I'm not seeing a huge amount of investment in like actual AI engineering and platform engineering for AI as well. That's a big gap. And then the other thing as well is two words that I didn't know at the start of the year as a phrase, as it were. I knew the word separately, obviously, but intelligent dependence. And so this concept of intelligent dependence being tied to the sovereign conversation is something Mike Bracken wrote about earlier in the year as part of Public Digital's blog post, where he was effectively articulating this idea that sovereignty is tied to the concepts of choice and agency, aligned with the concept of what to depend on, under which conditions, and for how long. And for me, it's the most succinct and wonderful way of thinking about sovereignty, because as Simon Wardley's been saying, and I'm a huge fan of what Simon Wardley's been putting out this year as well, it's not about geographic location. It's about how well you understand your stack, how informed you are to make choices, your ability to make choices as well, especially over the long term, and what should be a commodity versus where differentiated value lives. All of these concepts that intermingle, but fundamentally it's not about data residency, for example. And I think where AI and sovereignty have mixed, the example I've come back to a number of times when we've been talking about enterprise open source has been this idea that Red Hat, I would say, is moving towards of any model, any accelerator, any hardware, any cloud. That's a very clear landscape of agency and choice and control. But then I look at government organizations, for example, that have signed large enterprise agreements with proprietary vendors, sometimes just by default rather than design. It's not deliberate. It's just the person that's a de facto solution provider, but also with big announcements around data residency without the awareness and intelligence to notice the residency for the data is there, but what about data in transit and data in use? Where's the inferencing happening, for example? Because the GPUs are not in the UK. We've got a real constraint around that. So these are all themes that I think tie into like sprawl, shadow IT, shadow AI, legacy. Broadly speaking, I think it's been an evolution of what I was talking about last year, but intelligent dependence, sovereignty, and of course, those two dreaded letters that are dominating most boardrooms right now, AI, it's been a lot to go after.
It's interesting because strangely enough, the sovereignty thing hasn't really come in for me. It's just starting to, but it aligns for me with right workload, right location. But being heavily from a cloud background, I know that there are ways to mitigate anybody getting access to data. You know, it does add levels of complexity, but you can manage it. I knew AI was coming, but you and I have have spoken to multiple customers about AI, and I think you picked up from me where most organizations had an AI department already. We just called them data scientists, but they're now being brought in from shadow IT, a word that you've just used. They're being pulled into the mainstay. They're getting the support that they want to. So that has been a really nice conversation with me. I've run data teams in the past. I know that they're all a bit over there, but now it's great to have them coming in. I think that the biggest one for me is the whole virtualization piece. I didn't, and I've said this in a number of talks that I've given and a number of customers, I honestly never thought I would be speaking about Virt in 2025. That was a done deal when I first started my career. Who would have thought that that would have been such a fun conversation? But it's interesting, the conflict that you're seeing within organizations of moving to cloud native, but still wanting to keep hold of virtual machines and things like that. I found that a very, very kind of weird path that organizations are on. And I understand it. I think there's this pressure to move to the cloud. We're not necessarily, and it comes back to my mantra is right workloads, right location. If it's customer facing, throw it out there, throw it out in the cloud, get it working out there. If you need that ability to flex and scale and move up and down, so maybe pre-production environments, we don't want them running all the time. Build that stuff in the cloud. Don't buy to sit in your data centers, have it sat there doing nothing most of the time. Move all of the stuff there, do the flexing. So trying to get that across to organizations where they're going, but we should move everything to the cloud. It's like, well, hang on a minute. You might get some value both sides.
It's where the idea of intelligent dependence has really anchored into that idea of like right workload, right place, because I've had a few fantastic conversations related to these concepts of like sovereignty being tied to agency. And the thing that I think has been a limiting factor this year is a lot of binary decision making or binary thinking, where it is very anchored in the idea of like buy or build, maker or taker, and there's not necessarily a third way, which we know intimately from an enterprise open source perspective, because of fantastic products like Rosa, like Arrow, the fact that actually you can be in a place of leveraging the cloud as much as you want, but without being fully anchored into it, and knowing actually if you need to pull those workloads back on-prem, okay, you won't have Microsoft as your SREs necessarily. You won't have Red Hat SREs if you then pull it fully back on-prem in the way that you would do with the cloud managed service. But OpenShift is OpenShift is OpenShift. And isn't that magical to be able to go, here's a consistent, unified, scalable platform technology which can offer you this degree of optionality where you're not fully locked in. And I've kind of had this debate with a few people, really interesting conversations about lock-in this year, partly because of that scary situation for many organizations about their virtual machines, where your innovation budget, which was going to be AI experimentation, albeit research we did this year showed that only 89% of organizations, only 89%, I should say, a scary 89% of organizations are not delivering value. So we know that actually it's only 11% of organizations that are actually seeing value from AI at the moment. But effectively, that innovation budget, which could enable you to harness new technologies, do something great, partner with the right people, gets gobbled up when your effectively virtual machine renewal bill lands. So lock-in is an interesting question, but I had a fantastic conversation just yesterday with someone in government, actually, where I floated the idea that has come from our colleague, Joe, who works with Department of Work and Pensions at the moment. And Joe has said for a number of years, and in fact, my other colleagues as well in Red Hat, there's no such thing as lock-in really, but there is a cost of exit. And I floated this to someone in government and said, fundamentally, you know, it's a varied landscape, which is why I think so many people are looking to those cloud managed services to help them, where they have workloads that are probably going to be too painful to move out of VMs, but they do want to embrace the cloud. They do want to be able to operate something on a consistent platform, minimize sprawl. It's all good, albeit it's fascinating that there are workloads people don't feel like they can fully modernize out of VMs. I think that's really interesting, as you alluded to. But the idea that actually with lock-in, it's just cost. Like I've said a few times, there are certain organizations where you won't be locked in, but getting your applications, your data, all of that back would require hiring a band of mercenaries and shipping them out to a data center in the US to retrieve your assets. Does that mean you're not locked in? I guess so. But really, how do you know that data is not proliferated across other data centers? Like, how do you fully know that you've stayed in control with certain organizations? You can't. So cost of exit for something like that, cost of risk for something like that, huge. Equally, though, what was pointed out to me was it's not just cost in a monetary sense. And the reason why lock-in actually should be considered very real and something we're seeing, I think, in the virtualization space, is time. And it's why I worry about that AI legacy piece as well. We're seeing modern legacy from an overcommitment to proprietary black box solutions, which will lead to this kind of modern legacy, the future legacy, legacy of tomorrow. Because, okay, if you're willing to spend a huge amount of money to exit and move away from your existing solution once you've overcommitted when you only know half the story, that's one thing. But how long would it take, and can you afford that time? Which is why I still think finding capabilities, technologies, solutions that enable you to harness innovative tech, whether that be open source, whether that be the cloud, but without baking yourself into something at a point in time where the world of tech is going to continue rapidly evolving, and the threat landscape, as we've seen this year, is also going to continue rapidly evolving. So, like, don't overcommit when you only know half the story, because the cost in time and money that it might take to fix that mess, as we know, and why so many organizations are still reliant upon VMs in a more container or serverless dominated world, is because those decisions matter and they hang around for a hell of a long time afterwards.
And to kind of align with you there, because that heavily points at the AI story, without you saying the filthy two letters. The reality is that, yes, we're at what I would consider, I think virtualization was one of the first major technology shifts that I really went through, followed then by the cloud. But in reality, that was just a movement of virtualization off to making somebody else run it for you. And I don't think I think containers was just taking everything that we already done, making it smaller and stacking it on the top of everything we've done. And that's not to say containers are not a problem and they're not the right thing. It is just a description of infrastructure, and we added infrastructure on the top. But I think AI is such a major game changer, and I'm staying neutral on it at this moment in time. But what I'm seeing is organizations that are fighting to get deeply involved with something that is so transformative and so fluid at this moment in time, and making commitments when there's a whole load of organizations can't even patch servers on a yearly cycle. And you're like, why are you committing to something that is, and to give the Red Hat example, our OpenShift AI platform has been rewritten twice this year, I believe, because we've had to separate bits out for MCP to work and VLLM and all of that kind of stuff. And that is our bread and butter, and we've had to do that, and we can commit to that because we know that's the iterative cycle. Yet you and I both speak to organizations that literally the idea of having to upgrade a K8 cluster once every now 4 months, maybe 3 months, is something that they find difficult. Yet they're willing to go, we want to go all in on this AI. All right. That could be fun for you in 6 months when that technology is more than likely null, void, completely different, and leaving you exposed.
Is that, I mean, it's almost, I think, one of my learnings from this year as well and when I talk about that skills gap being actually truly a leadership gap, I think the leadership gap also aligns to the fact that people are looking at AI still through the lens of it being a technology problem. And actually, this anchors back to how technology has been mistreated and misunderstood over the years. Fundamentally, much like all technology, this is not really a tech problem. It's a strategy problem. And so the leadership gap directly aligns to a need for people who can think in a different way, strategically about these solutions, but with AI more than anything else, also about the knock-on effect that it will have on the workforce, on the skills that are required. And so where we do have these capabilities, like, are we in a place where it's okay to have a different Kubernetes platform on our Google Cloud, on our Azure Cloud, on our AWS Cloud, and on premise, and then potentially at the edge, and then have multiple different variants of those? If we have that landscape, then we are losing and wasting so many of the skills and capable people to reinventing the wheel. And it's one of the reasons why I think for me as well this year, I tried to capture some of this, because I think it's necessary for the AI landscape. Like, AI is chucking on a whole bunch of new stuff, and importantly as well with this, it's mainly Gen AI. I think we already know that, you know, there's AI is nothing new, but the Gen AI wave, and wherever that leads, has introduced a lot of new pressures, a lot of new opportunities, a lot of new solutions, a hell of a lot of snake oil. But if we do need to aggregate and commoditize more things in order to liberate the people, the compute potentially as well, and the time, then fundamentally, if we are in this position, we really need to be thinking about our organizations quite differently. We need to be giving them a quite intense strategic review where we actually interrogate where we're building, how we're building, and why we're building. And arguably, I think that that's, you know, it's quite confronting for most people, because it's not a set of technical challenges about defining a set of boxes. You know, it's like the classic thing around architecture being a lot of boxes. It's not about the boxes. It is about fast flow, value streams, the alignment of people. That's a load of strategic questions bundled on top of the future direction of a whole massive horizon that is quite hard to digest quite easily and quickly. So that is like a 2025 observation. I think it's a question of, have we got people that are out there listening to this, understanding that the way this needs to work is not just about, I mean, I think in fairness as well, it's why so many people are quite quick to hand this off to a large enterprise provider and sort of wash their hands of it, which is fine if you're not too overcommitted, because in the interim, that might be okay. It might be worthwhile.
But that's interesting you say that. So this is where everybody went to the cloud in the first place, handed it off, found it difficult. And then, like I say, we overlay K8s on the top. And, you know, and you know the reason why I work for Red Hat and the reason why I sell OpenShift, and particularly the managed OpenShift, is because I've been there. I fought that. I did the cloud. I did the K8 stuff. And the reality is it brings so little value to have lots of people deeply diving in at that level. Like you said, it's all about that. Why are we building there, and why are we building it in this way when we have an option that is done for us? And if we need to tweak it a little bit, we still have the ability to access, drive that change. But we can focus on doing the stuff that we haven't been able to do. We can remove the idea of how hard it is to patch things, how hard it is to, you know, we can keep our teams doing BAU. We can have our teams innovating in an innovative world that AI is, like I said.
It comes back to that fundamental theme. And I think going into 2026, if I was to look for a shift in the way that organizations are approaching this space, approaching their technology questions and challenges, it would be to hang on to that word agency and actually think about a space where, if they were to define common interoperable standards and principles that almost safeguard them for the future, I don't think we're that far away from being able to go below a certain line if our focus essentially moves closer to the user. And this is what AI kind of does, because the relationship with the user and the way that AI should be taking away the toil and the friction that's not useful, at least, because some friction is useful. Some friction acts as like an enabling constraint that helps us to actually focus and be better at what we do. And a complete free-for-all smorgasbord, you know, we'd all be so overweight that we'd never be able to go anywhere ever again. We'd never fit out the doors to our houses because we just, you know, I think actually you can have too much of a good thing. So some friction, some enabling constraints can be beneficial. But the unhelpful friction, the classic thing, you know, I want AI to do the laundry and wash the dishes. I don't want it to create art and write literature necessarily, albeit AI is this huge democratizing force. Gen AI, at least, is a huge democratizing force for creativity, which I think a lot of people have enjoyed. But if we are going to use it to amplify human expertise, if we're going to use it to actually deliver on the potential and scope of people, then it does mean liberating us from more of the toil and more of the friction that we don't need, all of the bottlenecks in our organizations and bureaucracy and governance that slow us down and hold us back. So how do we do that? And I'm a firm believer that that is through commoditization, through looking at the things that actually the world has solved a million times over. People are not buying a mortgage product because of the operating system that your servers are running. Fundamentally, people are not leveraging a government service because you're using a certain base image in your containers. Fundamentally, there are certain questions that actually have been answered thoroughly enough for us to go, that makes sense as a consistent open standard. And actually, especially for us in the tech space, we know that we like solving problems. You know, I spent weeks and weeks this year actually with the Land Rover that I've mentioned to you before, weeks and weeks trying to figure out why there was a voltage leakage off of one of my rear brake lights coming through to my reversing camera. And instead of I rewired it, I added a new harness to part of it, added new loads of extra bits and pieces until eventually I was just like, I need a relay. And no one had necessarily solved that direct problem before because no one had the exact setup. That's a fun engineering challenge. Now with the relays on it, it works flawlessly. And I get to hear a nice satisfying click when I put it into reverse. It is great. But that's differentiated value from my unique setup. If I was trying to define a brand new wiring loom for a Land Rover Defender, I'd be an idiot because the schematics already exist. There is already a well-defined, well-designed solution. And okay, it's not going to be flawless and perfect because it's a Defender, much like Kubernetes. You know, it leaks in the roof. That's Kubernetes if I was to ever describe it. But we can define and agree upon a set of common underlying solutions and foundations that should be substantive open standards. And I find it really promising that there are movements and bodies like Finos, for example, that have looked across the financial sector and gone, we don't need to be competing here. We can commoditize. Now, whether that be a consistent OS, whether it be actually all agreeing that GitOps is the best way of doing some of this stuff, and we should ensure that it's auditable and consistent, I think that enables us to accelerate. But my desire would be to see leaders who understand that if we are going to move towards this AI driven future and agents, for all the hype that's been around them this year, I don't think we're there yet, for example. If that's where we're going, then as leaders, it's vitally important to abstract complexity, commoditize more capabilities, and try and push for consistent open standards that remove the toil, remove the friction, and liberate the thought space to actually do some good with AI, not just create slop.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I think actually I look at AI and like I commented on the fact that it's massively and rapidly changing, but it seems to be the first time ever that a very wide remit of organizations, implementers, and builders are trying to tick that box of let's apply some level of consistency across everything where we can. And it's I think the best way to describe it for me is it comes to the VHS versus Betamax, HD DVD versus Blu-ray, where there might be a couple and they're fighting. What I hope is, unlike in both those cases, actually the better standard wins out as opposed to the ones with the biggest marketing budget. But the reality is, I think this is the first time in tech I've seen that real let's try and make this stuff work together. Let's get it right first time for interoperability because it saves us all time, heartache, and pain. The problem is we're implementing things and there's a big shift and we keep moving very, very quickly. So just as standards are defined, there's a whole new level of technology and platform coming and things like that. So I 100% agree with you. I think maybe AI is going to be the first point in time where we get very close to that. Hopefully we deliver the dream that you're talking about.
Fingers crossed.
So let's giving all of that view, have there been any organizations, customers, and don't obviously name them, or any conversations that you've had where things have been particularly wrong? I love that one. That's always a good question.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I think one of the fairly recent moment that I thought summed up quite a few things for me, and was almost disappointing is the wrong word, because actually by the end of the conversation, the person had shifted their mindset, but it was a conversation about de facto providers into government departments, where they fairly unequivocally kind of said, oh yeah, we're a so-and-so shop. Like, I won't give the game away too much, but where they said, oh yeah, we're a so-and-so shop. And diving into that question of, what does that mean? And how did you reach that conclusion? What led you to that path of having a declarative banner, especially as a governmental organization, where you can say, oh, we're this shop? And I think many of us who've worked in and around tech for long enough have either seen firsthand or have heard enough horror stories to remember the days of large proprietary providers that would tie organizations in for decades-long contracts with no exit opportunity. Those organizations have plenty of good people working for them. Those, vendors have plenty of people who did things like that with good intent, albeit also getting a fairly substantial payday off the back of it. But I think there was a period of time where it felt like government especially had shifted in a direction where it didn't feel like people were going to be as beholden. But actually somehow, whether it be due to, the ease of procurement, the sunk cost fallacy, the dominance of certain providers, we do see now a landscape where actually there's kind of no way out. And the pattern of thinking is just, oh, well, I'll just see what that proprietary vendor provides. Now, in some ways, what's fortunate is that actually for us with these cloud managed services that actually are owned and run by the hyperscalers, for example, you can go to your de facto provider and say, I want to use an enterprise open source solution, and they will give it to you. And I think that's amazing. And we should be looking for more of that. We should be pressing for more of that fundamentally across all organizations. Things like DORA regulations as well in the banking space, nudge in that direction of going, leverage cloud for all of the good it brings, but just make sure that you don't get lazy. Make sure that you're not complacent, because fundamentally it's legislation like that that is a forcing factor. I just read a really interesting post from Simon Wardley, actually, where he was talking about data centers in space and why certain organizations who might be less morally scrupulous are going to love data centers in space because of the fact there will be no clear jurisdiction. Who built the satellite? Where's it beaming back to? Who owns the patents? Whose data is it? And as soon as you're in a tangle of globalized, space-based, messy legislation, guess what? No one can enforce anything because nothing's obvious anymore. But I think for me, it's the kind of like how passive certain decisions have been. Now, in terms of other things that I've seen, the thing that I'll just bolt onto that is the ongoing prevalence of sprawl and the fact that actually with AI, it's getting worse. There are organizations, the final organization actually this year came off of gov.uk PaaS, which was a Cloud Foundry platform owned and run by GDS. There was an announcement a few years ago that that was being deprecated. There wasn't really a clear logic around why it was being deprecated, if I'm being honest. The main argument was cloud services are good enough now that you don't need a PaaS within government. But that, again, was a reinforcement of sprawl, because what we didn't see was a whole bunch of departments exit gov.uk PaaS and then create microservice-based solutions where, okay, then you go, yeah, fair enough. There's no infra. Like you described, Reese, there's no need for a platform as a service. There's no need for infrastructure as a service because you've just skipped all that bit. Instead, what we've seen is yet another large-scale Kubernetes platform being spun up at great expense to the taxpayer. So for me, that's heartbreaking because, my God, do we already have enough of these? But especially for arm's length bodies, for agencies, for small governmental organizations, like if you're an enormous department and you've ended up with an on-prem environment and the Kubernetes platform, again, I would love to see them standardized and interoperable. I kind of get it though. The size and scale of what you're doing, I get it. But to be an arm's length body that has invested millions of pounds in spinning up yet another Kubernetes platform, it kind of hurts my head. And so that's one of those things where it's just that there's friction, but I think with AI as well. And to be fair, when you and I were in Wales together, a fantastic event, serverless days, absolute one of the highlights of the year, brilliant and really interesting event with wonderful people. But near the end of the day, there were some brilliant talks, fantastic talks about how people are working with AI coding assistants, partly reassuring as well, because people went, the value is dubious, so we're not going to overcommit. We're actually pausing and parking it, and we're going to come back to this at a later date. How fantastic, how honest as well. Like, that's inspiring leadership. But the thing that hurt my head was the massive scale of duplication rather than a cross-governmental initiative. And especially in places where the budget is really tight. Again, genius people, brilliant people, but I'd rather that a local authority wasn't maybe doing this right now, because I think they're struggling so much that actually there could be more aggregated, consolidated, centralized governance and government initiatives that help and support, that don't lead to a monoculture, but maybe mitigate the sprawl. Like, stop the sprawl is still the slogan I think we need to be chanting across government and across the public sector.
So having worked with and alongside GDS on various things, completely agree there. I think GDS V1 was such a pivotal change in government ways of working around tech. It was truly great to see and watch and understand. And although it possibly didn't reach down far enough, because there were this, like you said, there's smaller departments, there's local government that could all do with that support. They still did a great job at the higher level. And I think, fingers crossed, we do go back that direction. Completely agree with you. But you're right, from what I'm seeing, conversations, because obviously of speaking to different people, different organizations, is that maybe that focus that was there has now gone. And AI has caused that, where everybody is off doing a million different AI things. But never mind. On the flip side of that, good examples. Have we got any good examples?
So the absolute counterpoint to what I've just described and discussed, Nicola, who is head of design at Ministry of Justice, that team in Ministry of Justice created this year the Government Reuse Library. It's something that has not gained a huge amount of buy-in or focus just yet, but a very dedicated, smart, switched-on team have effectively spun up this MVP of a reuse library. Working with a few people in GDS as well, I think that actually we are so close to being able to integrate and implement some code scraping features and introduce capabilities that would basically capture all of the public sector information. So at the moment, the reuse library is broadly focused around design systems, but that could extend and expand out into anything that government has created. And I would love to see this as partially a precursor to government actually investing in open source program offices and thinking about inner source and open source properly, defining open source within government and ensuring that actually it's in the tech code of practice, but open source is seen as a life cycle, not just a one directional, create a thing, chuck it out to the open and then hope someone maybe uses it. So that idea of like open source as a community, not just effectively a kind of mono-directional thing, that's vitally important for me. I think that's really, really important. And it starts with initiatives like Nicola's team in MOJ have been kicking off. I think there's also scope and scale there. Like, a really fun conversation that we've been having is to see if we can leverage Gen AI capability to actually build off the concept. You don't know what you don't know. So is this something where Gen AI is actually uniquely positioned, paired up with good search? But this is not talking about search. This is co-creation. This is co-ideation, as it were, to go, I know I need to do this, or I know my service should be delivering these capabilities. What's out there? And maybe some of that gets vibed or schematic-based coded for you by AI, but maybe it simply just goes, oh, you can use this, 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 this. Don't reinvent the wheel. So for me, that's been a really fantastic, inspiring conversation. I think equally as well, there have been some brilliant people, but my favorite day this year was getting over 11 government departments together for a day that was all about open source innovation in Gov. So all of us in a room, mapping out the user needs that we've got, working in groups to think about different ideas, concepts. And that actually came back to the idea that discoverability is the starting point of greater open source capability across Gov. It would be a dramatic shift to the operating model. I think we've got big gaps at the moment around ownership and accountability. And also we would need more commoditized platform capabilities, because GDS has done an amazing and wonderful job with services like gov.uk, forms, pay, notify. Obviously digital ID has now been moved out into the cabinet office, so that's quite intriguing. But I would love to see internal users being treated as users. So this whole thinking of platform as a product, the first users of a platform are the people who create a platform, and then effectively your second set of users that you consider are those internal customers. We treat the users of a platform as our customers. I think there are not enough things being done in government to create centralized platform as a service solutions effectively that serve internal users, e.g. civil servants and people working in government and governmental bodies. But the work of wonderful people in GDS, I mean, I've had great fun speaking to people like Chris Nesbitt-Smith, who's working on NDX, National Digital Exchange, which is like a marketplace, lots of great ideas, some good conversations with people like Dimitris, Chief Architect for Government, again, really interesting guy, great ideas, and the Engineering Excellence team as well, to have a special shout out, because they are people in a difficult landscape trying to build connection, trying to help us, for example, find the people that we could do some work with on an AI-empowered path to production. Like, I'm a firm believer that code creation is not the bottleneck, and it's arguably the art form. It can accelerate things with AI, but we don't necessarily need to have even more and more and more code. And I think most people in the DevOps space would acknowledge that. It's about quality code, quality engineering, not just churning stuff out for the sake of it. Like, lines of code is the worst measure you could ever use for productivity and value. But where we can have a very dramatic impact with AI, I firmly believe, is the path to production. How we go from idea to reality. So all those things around testing and governance and some of the guardrails we need in place, documentation, there's a lot that can be done with Gen AI, and especially in terms of assurance and then defining that like conversion of idea to something deliverable into a real service. Gen AI can really help in that space, and GDS have been fantastic champions to try and help us join up with different people in Gov and execute on the idea of improving that value stream. So those are a few people who get a shout out, but I'm very lucky to work with a lot of inspiring and interesting people who do fill me with hope, albeit it is like that classic Mark Schwartz quote that I often go back to, of like, being a CTO is like banging your head against a brick wall and then one day the wall starts to move. And the bit that I often add on is, it just depends how willing to be concussed you are. And I think for a lot of people in Gov, there's quite a few concussions, but there's still people there banging their heads.
It does sadden me, though, that you don't think that the holy grail of Gen AI and code generation is the fact that there are comments put in people's code. You know, that's the be all and end all for me. It's interesting, and this kind of ties back with some of the things that you were talking about, what you're talking about there, of this consistency, this prevalence, this platform, and everything's above, is like the big example I've seen this year, and discoverability is what you're talking about, and what MOJ seem to be picking up and doing. And the reuse library is the amount of conversations I've had with customers and their partners about OpenShift and how that brings consistency. You know, it's an opinionated platform. That's if you ever do a workshop with me, that's one of the first things I say. But the value of that opinion is it's based on tens of thousands of customers with hundreds of thousands of clusters. But more importantly, a third-party supplier coming into a customer knows exactly what they're getting. The customer has already said, this is our standard and this is our expected standard. You have to live to that. And that transition, and the reason why I think I've seen it so much more this year is because there's that 3 to 5 year cycle. I've been with Red Hat 3 years, longest I've been with any organization since being in IT, by the way. But it's that understanding consistency, and everybody knows where they are. Whereas previously, at this point in time, where the 3 to 5 year renewing contracts, SIs changing, consultancies changing, always brought about that friction. And I know you've involved me with a couple of conversations with partners, but I think tying back to this is almost the global standard. And what I'm starting to see is that everybody went to the cloud, and that was the standard, and then they were all different. K8s was the standard, but it was all different. We've now got OpenShift that is truly becoming the new operating system. I know we've spoken about this in the past. quite well about it. It is just there, and you stick your stuff on top, and it gets supported from there.
I think that's vitally important, though. Like the consistency and reuse. When I've talked to customers, and I've had some great chats this year about the idea that actually you can just have consistency across all of those environments. You know, that brilliant case study from National Energy Systems Operator, where all of their non-production environments run in the cloud on a managed service on Azure, and all of their production environments, which are critical national infrastructure, are running on-premise. But it's a consistent layer of the same platform technology across all of that space. And when we had those outages in the cloud this year, it was really illuminating to see the organizations that, and this was something I tried to mention earlier, actually, I forgot where I was going with one of my threads. The differentiation that I think there now is between mono cloud, multiple cloud, multi-cloud, and hybrid cloud. Mono cloud being you're in one cloud and that's it. You're a so-and-so shop, an Azure shop, an AWS shop, whatever you might say. Multiple cloud, where, okay, you've got your AWS and your Azure, but never the twain shall actually meet. You haven't got interoperability. You've not got those common standards. You haven't standardized around S3 or GitOps or whatever it might be. They are, you know, divided. They're proprietary stacks that are separate. Multi-cloud, where you've got consistency across cloud, and then hybrid cloud, where that consistency extends into on-prem and the edge. I think that delineation is vitally important, and it's something that we haven't had. It's why I've been kind of making that up, really, to go, I think we need a better way to talk about this. Because when you approach an organization and say, surely your cloud strategy, when your AWS falls over because of DNS, or your Azure falls over because of DNS, would you not want those two stacks to be interoperable? And okay, like, we are living in a world where things are better a lot of the time in the cloud, because the tax that we pay of that one outage a year versus everyone individually managing their own tin means, broadly speaking, like, you pay the tax that one time a year, we're in a really good position. But at the same time, could it not be better if you really want to have two clouds or more, or on-prem and the cloud? Why on earth would you not want those to be able to be fully interoperable? Why would you not want to be in a place where actually you've not used proprietary base images in your containers and therefore you can't move workloads around? Like, come on.
I think it goes a step beyond that. It's interesting this year. When I first started in K8, everybody's hailed it as being that ability to be multi-cloud, but everybody's, yeah. I never thought it would come off. I honestly never thought it would come off, but I've certainly seen it over the past year. Managed OpenShift has definitely helped that. A lot of conversations with customers about, we have this workload and we can't let it meet with this workload, but we want to work in exactly the same way. How do we do that? Hyperscaler, managed OpenShift, thank you very much. And so many of them have kind of got involved in that. And this year has been truly a blessing to see that moving around. You talked about one of your customers, Lisa, was it, I think it was, where all of their dev is done in the cloud, and then it goes to critical national infrastructure, where, you know, there's a massive media provider where their third party came in and went, well, we'll develop by ear because we can turn stuff on and off, and then you run it on your infrastructure because it's expensive what they deliver and stuff. And I'm starting to see a lot more of that from also FSI organizations, but other organizations as well, where they go, we don't like these things sitting next to one another, or we like this here and that there. And it's great for me, as an old fart who's been in the industry for quite some time. It is really nice to see the fact that we are getting that almost, I'm not going to say utopia, that's the wrong word, but that flexibility and the ability, and more importantly, the hyperscalers are on the journey with us. I've now spoken to fireworks. I've now spoken to perfect time now.
That was immaculate.
Yeah, at least 3 of the hyperscalers at different levels and different things, where they understand customers want that flexibility, and they realize that they need that flexibility. And actually, the easiest way to do it is to give them the platform that they need that allows them to focus on bringing value.
Yeah. Because
otherwise they're spending all of their time, like you said, knocking a head against, but it's hyperscaler against hyperscaler, with the customer not getting any benefit out of the end of it. So, yeah. Right, the big one. 26, maybe even 27. What do you think? What's coming? What's going to be the big thing for the next 12 to 18 months?
I think the proliferation of technologies like VLM and LLMD as being like the runtime for AI, I see that being something that gets on more people's radars. Like inferencing is going to take off. We're going to move beyond API-driven AI. And I think equally, like when we move past the snake oil of agentic and actually move towards a space of like something that is more akin with having agentic capabilities, it will involve small language models, which therefore means that we need decomposable AI technologies and effectively a kind of daisy-chained stack, which means that we can have persona-based or role-based, quantized or fine-tuned small language models that put us in a domain where actually this thing that is an expert in this space can do it. And there are going to be capabilities that enable walls and guardrails to exist between those things as well, because really, I don't want in my stack a bunch of agents that have got unfettered access to my calendar and my credit card and my email, because I may as well just be publishing my information on the internet. But I maybe do want a protocol with guardrails, and especially if I've got like a governor agent across the whole landscape that can critically assess, well, should we be giving the credit card information to the calendar agent? Maybe not, but actually holiday booking agent wants to authorize a holiday, it's validated with calendar agent. You know, you see how it starts to triangulate and join up. But I think small language models therefore gain more importance and a bigger and more important role. Decomposable AI technologies that are less monolithic and less black box gain a new and more important role. And if we are pursuing this future, especially one in which we are moving towards like post-quantum cryptography as well, which could completely transform the security landscape, whilst also increasing compute density to a large amount, you know, there's a lot of good that could be done. But the last thing as well, though, is I really hope to see slightly different economic models around some of this as well, where actually we have a deeper and richer understanding of delivering these capabilities in a way that benefits the average person and that empowers the average person, rather than it necessarily being the kind of economic flow that seems to be occurring at the moment. And that's purely a kind of personal wish list item, really, as it were, that I think this could be tech for good. It doesn't necessarily have to be tech that just lines the pockets of a very small few. So huge promise, huge opportunity, but also like a good dose of healthy cynicism to go, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. But at the very least, if we democratize this technology and define a landscape in which it does what we're looking for, there is a chance, and hopefully this is a good note to round off on, I think there is a good chance that actually this technology could lead somewhere positive, and we could see a lot of rewarding positive outcomes, especially if we keep in mind security, sustainability, and sovereignty.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jonny. It's been great talking to you. Great to understand your year and where you've been and who you've been talking to. And we'll keep an eye out to see if we all end up with equal amounts of cash from AI in the future.
Who knows? Thank you so much as always, Reese. An absolute pleasure to speak to you as ever. And I look forward to picking up these conversations another time, hopefully with some of your viewers at the pub. Who knows? Definitely. Maybe another AWS meetup.
Well, I'm still waiting to produce the poster for the Jonny and Reese UK and Ireland not quite music tour.
We can sing if they want us to.
Yeah. Anybody who wants us to talk at their events, let us know. We can talk about platforms, AI, anything you want, so long as it's vaguely IT related. Thank you very much, Jonny. Look after yourself. Great Christmas and New Year, and I'll speak to you soon.
Take care.